sausage, engaged in a kind of bacchanalian orgy that turns ecstatic and off-putting, all of which was set to a sound collage of pop songs and street noises. A few years later, Schneemann pushed the idea of multimedia in another direction in her work Snows. Here the artist combined film and live performance in a startling work of kinetic theater which examined the effects of the Vietnam War. And in a brilliant installation from the early 1970s up to and including her limits, Schneemann made a room-sized graffito-based drawing while hanging from a harness fixed to the room ceiling. Schneemann's methodology, one might say, has always had a combinatory logic, embracing the both-and rather than the either-or. It is both painting and performance, both personal and political. The list could go on and on. All this said, Carolee has always claimed painting as the wellspring of her practice. In her 1975 book, Saison, She Was a Great Painter, which recently underwent a wonderful reprint, Schneemann writes of the inspiration she took in the Frenchman's work, mistakenly thinking that he was a woman, and I think her pronunciation at the time was something like Cézanne, and thus finding in her a strong female role model. Schneemann dedicated herself to painting from that moment on. In many ways, Carolee's involvement with performance, I think, grew out of her engagement with painting. It came out of struggling with its pleasures and its problems. Trying to figure out a way to get the body into painting, to make painting bodily, she created a series of photographic self-portraits in her studio in New York's Fur District in 1963, which feature her naked body disappearing into and standing out from a group of her assemblage paintings. The resulting work, I Body, 36 Transformative Actions, insists on the embodiness of vision, and in so doing, it presented a challenge to the opticality and the strict medium specificity of so much modern art. Once she broke down such divisions, almost everything seemed fair game. Schneemann's promiscuous practice has embraced experimental erotica, such as her 1965 film Fuses, to performance lectures such as 1975's Interior Scroll, in which she slowly read a text that she removed from her vagina. Significantly, both of these works insist on the primacy and particularity of the female body and the female voice. Schneemann has been the subject of a number of important one-woman shows. A career retrospective opens at the Museum de Moderne Salzburg in the fall of 2015. She is currently the featured artist at the Artists Institute in New York. I could list many more of Carolee's honors, including the Kellogg Medal of the Arts. But in a way, this doesn't seem quite institutional validation as much as it has advocated personal exploration. Instead of enumerating Carolee's long list of achievements, awards, and exhibitions then, I want simply to offer her importance, influence, and impact. In talking with students about Carolee's upcoming visit these last few weeks, no small number have asked me, Carolee Schneemann.
event. This is my hockey stick, but okay, well, this is probably worse than it looks. I haven't had time to practice this. This is all new. It's an injury, so you won't catch it, don't worry. But I'm going to start with a sense of the gift of being here, and all of you here, and the gift of these early drawings, which I'm starting with them because they're so predictive. Why did I imagine that a free girl had to have 3 legs and chasing an apple? But here it is, it's come to pass, right? Coffee went? Yeah. Thank you. I want to thank my decorating team, the packagers here. They've been absolutely wonderful. Julianne Schwartz, most of all, thank you. Alex, where are you? Untrained rapper learned at an institute. Who did all the maneuvering. So it's amazing to be back at Bard with all these people I don't know and many friends. It's the transition, like the birds in flight, the momentum of time and our renewals here. Can I be heard in the back? Yeah. Okay, good, okay. All right, so let's see if this little thing works. Just this is forward? Yeah. All right, so I come from a family that deeply, deeply discouraged art as being wasteful and subversive, and for a young woman taking her away from her proper functions, which were to have a nice husband and make babies, all of which I fled with as much determination as any human being could. And that determination, luckily, involved a full scholarship to Bard, room, board, tuition, everything, because my dad, who was wonderful, refused to send a girl to college. So when these little drawings turned up, they were definitely a gift from the art-denying realm. And I'm going to start with them because they have such predictive aspects. The one that we're looking at here is I think so very carefully observed. I'm 4 years old, and I'm drawing my brother in a bassinet, and he's throwing a toy. And I remind you all who are interested in my early erotic works, those are little baby feet sticking up. I'm just going to show a few of these because this has some mysterious narrative propensity for fractured connection, for the relationships of the imagination which settle in, and there's no way to explain it. There's no theory, there's no semiotics, there's no Freudian undertow. You will see a little hand reaching out, yes. Signage that seems to be broken and leading to somewhere. ghostly figures partly erased, mysterious numbers that might be very full of portent, but we can't know why. And I hope that my work continues in this unfathomable direction. And I'll just show one early significant iconography, the pussycat, which some of you know is going to weave through all my work, including the erotic film Fuses, the first self-shot woman's depiction of sexual pleasure. But that film was premised on the basis of the shameless regard of Jim Tenney and my cat Kitch's constant purring regard whenever we were intimate. So I'd like to say that the cat is like the director. The cat says yes to all this. Also, this is interesting because the cat is the dominant figuration. The people have disappeared. They're only attached by a lifeline, like a kind of niche that's an umbilicus that makes the cat carry forward. And the cat is carrying forward on my obsession with the staircase, which becomes much later connected to Duchamp and French expressions for missing knowledge, the lost staircase, the empty staircase. But for me, as a child, the staircase was an absolute bewilderment because you put one foot down and then where's your other leg and the rest of your body? I don't know how the rest of you feel, but this is still perplexing me. All right, I'm going to early years at Bard. I must tell you, the art department was very disappointed in me, as I was in them. Everything I did was annoying to them, including that I used my hands too much when I was speaking to the German expressionist refugee teacher. So I had a brilliant boyfriend here named Wayne Battelle. And in a way, we studied perception and art history and slept together and taught one another what we felt was missing from school. But I still love this work because it's so sensuous. It anticipates so many aspects of embodiment. And what's open and what's closed and what presents itself erotically. So there's the innocence of fruit that is carrying a huge erotic charge for me. Then that extends to my early still lives. At Bard, I was told by my good teacher, the one who taught me how to roll garlic in a wooden bowl and smoke cigars and never tried to get in my pants, Louis Shanker. He said, don't set your heart on art, you're only a girl. These were landscape paintings that I would do outside, near Zabriskie. And what's interesting to me is the intensity of the gesture, the kind of dynamic of responding to what, as a landscape painter, I believe could only be a failure. It's always a failure because the wind changes. The tree isn't there anymore. The light suffuses. I have to go pee. Everything that is insisting that I see more clearly is changing in front of me. So one of the things that Bard never had for a female student was a life model, although some of us were coerced often into being nude models for, no, you couldn't have a nude model at Bard in the late 50s. No, sorry, wrong idea. So my partner, James Tenney, became my life model. And here I'm experimenting with the Navi, with VR, with Bonnard. I wanted to start to study the intimacy of domestic light and interiors. An early nude work, this is a portrait of Jane Brackage Woodney. And it's painted when Stan Brackage and Jane would come and stay with Jim Tenney and me, creating tremendous unhappiness and tension because the Stan needed to be valued, appreciated, adored, and not to have the companion of his best friend, James Tenney, vying for aesthetic position. So I don't think this was the painting of Jim that was why I was asked to leave Bard in my junior year. But something did, and it was referred to as a moral turpitude, which was close to moral turpentine, but it was twisted, and they were never I was never clear as to why I had to leave for moral turpitude, thank you. But they had to extend my scholarship somehow, so then I went to Columbia School of Painting and Sculpture, and the new school where I could continue working with Heinrich Blücher, who was here famously and wonderfully, and with his wife, Anna Arndt. So this painting of Jim was removed from the junior exhibit. Why? Anybody have an idea? Well, you're all too shy to say what it is, huh? It was really considered obscene, not just that he was nude, but that he was with an exposed genital, and no girl had the right to display or assume or portray that. They could do us, but, you know, it was in 1959 or 60, wasn't okay. But I was very happy with this painting. Do you all see the three cats in it, or are you still looking between his legs? It's a test. There are actually three pussy cats moving Good, you've all seen it, okay. An early painting inspired by my constant aesthetic companion, Jim's music. He's studying Ives, Perez, Webern, Feldman, and the dissonance and concussive fracture relates so intensively to collage, to the tearing place where there's an incremental energy released. So this painting called Tenebration includes still images of musical icons. Here's a stick. This stick is going to recur mysteriously over and over again. It's going to look like interior scroll on the side. It's going to look like a staircase. It's going to solve a painting construction that won't resolve itself until I put this piece of wood into it. This piece of wood that I carried around from the streets of New York to graduate school at the University of Illinois. So there you see the stick on the right. It has an aspect of stabilizing as well as energizing the figurations of form that are around it. work from the mid-60s, a letter to Lou Andrea Salome. She's one of the great influences for me, partly because she's a fabulous historic figure who's been denigrated, ignored, maligned. She leaves Russia as a young woman, leaves her husband, leaves a child, and goes to Europe and has an astonishing intellectual affinity for artists and writers. She becomes very close to Tolstoy. She becomes a muse for Nietzsche, who goes crazy when she leaves their affinity. And she becomes a tremendous influence on Rilke. And when Rilke writes his poems to equity and to giving what you love most, it's freedom, that's partly inspired by Lou Andreas. So since I made this work, when she was a despised discovery, appreciations have accrued. So if you're too uncomfortable back there, you could be uncomfortable up here. There's more floor. Anybody want floor? Is what? And Freud. Thank you, thank you. Yes, that's so important. Yeah, she becomes a student of Freud, and most importantly for me, Andrea Salome breaks with Freud over his theory of narcissism, and she presents her own interpretation, which is really appropriate for a painterly sensibility. Come on, we're fine. It's cozy up here, right? Oh, goodness. Somebody can sit in a wheelchair. You can. Sit in a wheelchair? Yeah, sit in a wheelchair. Oh my. Anybody want someone on their lap? So I'm returning to Freud and his theory of narcissism and the contrary theory evolved by Lou Andrea Salome, which has to do with the dissolution of the self by the intensity of its attention to what it's perceiving. So it's not, her narcissism is not about the development of the ego. It's about the extreme attention and sensitivity that the self can pour into its perception. And as a painter and a feminist, that seemed to me the proper and acute and helpful dynamic. This is an important work from 1962 where I'm turning a painting into a sculpture. And of course, this is all very uncertain. I don't think it's a success, but it's an experiment. And Alan Capro sees it and says, this is important. And that, in some unpredictable way, seems like a validation. Okay, here's my favorite kind of work. This is from the childhood series. This is called The Exuberant Cat. And I really admire the simplicity of it, the iconographic accuracy of that cat head. But what's all that stuff coming down out of the bottle? Like these kind of lines of energy, what are they? So I've never known until 3 years ago when I'm working in Liverpool for an installation that's titled Precarious. I'm walking around and I see these sticks sticking up. And they really remind me of something intensively. But what? So, as most of you know, those are steel bits called rebar, and they're put in cement before the next layer of cement is poured onto it. But for me, they're a message from the exuberant cat. These forms persist, and it's up to me to trust them. So here's an exuberant cat. I'm in my apple tree that's going to be rolled down a few years later. And I'm in the harness and rope of my neighbor, Dwight, who came to prune the tree but went off to have lunch. And it becomes a work that some of you know persists for 8 or 9 years, permutations of up to and including her limits. And the magic of the rope is that when I really concentrate, the rope moves without my having any intention of motion. The premise is that I keep my arm extended with chalk or crayons in it and will draw on and off for 8 hours, standing up, sitting down. And then I have to decide, how do I replace myself? I've done the work to make a significant number of these drawings. How do I replace myself? Well, with video documentation and 6 monitors on which I've edited various incarnations seems appropriate. Well, now we have a treat. Okay, I'm going to show you Precarious, and I'll tell you just a bit before we start it, okay? I had one of my very, very rare commissions with the Tate Liverpool 4 years ago. And I was working on atrocities of animal torture, animal death, animal in cages, various forms of human degradations to animals, which included training ants to attack each other, training ducks to attack each other, and cages full of really beautiful cats that were reproduced in Canadian newspapers. The cages full of these cats were going to China to be soup. So these were some of my materials for Precarious, and they called me from Liverpool and said, we need a title. And I said, I work very slowly. I don't have a title, I don't know when I can. This makes me feel very precarious. So I went to the dictionary and said, that's a good word, and I looked it up. And in the dictionary, there were 3 definitions, examples for precarious. One, carriages carrying people through the countryside in Victorian America, the carriages were precarious. Workers at a certain factory had their wages changed without their permission. It was very precarious. The third one was life in Liverpool, going to 30s, was precarious. Yes, that's it. Okay, I got it. Turn these lights off too. Anybody near the lights? Anybody have a robot? Without the lights. It's about 6 minutes, so we'll be okay. have. And I had tried photographing wet leaves, and they were always wrong. And I had just one more session to edit in New York, and the storm was there, and the camera was there, and the battery was charged, and I got the sexual leaves. So I'm going backwards and forwards. I'm going to start with a request, I think, from Alex on the evolution of snows, my anti-Vietnam work that begins in the mid-60s. Can we dim the lights down there, lighting out the sides? Anybody know where his first find is? Anyway, that's a drawing preparatory for the performance. And all the performative works start with drawings. All the thinking of where work can develop starts with drawings. These are images that anticipate a full installation, multidimensional with intensive media projection for the word snows. It's also a friend of mine named Schneemann. And provoked by the endless bombardment of Vietnam. This is 1965. There's this mad installation of a theater that was graciously given to me by a theater owner who was also active against the Vietnam War. And I knew I wanted to build a complex installation that had a winter aspect. The theater was given to me for work in, I think it was early March. And Gimmel's department store was close to where I had a loft on 29th Street. And their Christmas decorations were luscious branches, crusted with falling snow, and I wanted them. And the night before we started to install, I went around to 33rd Street, and there they were. They were all thrown up and available, and my crew and I grabbed all these branches and headed back to the Martin Theater on 32nd Street, and it began to snow. So snows used juxtapositions of war imagery that had been suppressed, projected onto the bodies and the water flow. We trained the participants. My participants are never trained actors or performers or dancers. They're people I find somewhere and feel that they have a potential wonderful presence or imagery, or I'd like to have them work on this unraveling process with me. So the performers never knew the explicit images from Vietnam that were going to be so central to our own movements and improvisations. And I usually find some connective formal material that's ludicrous, that can be juxtaposed with something outrageous or destructive. So everyone who has a fantasy of the 60s as drugs, pleasure, rock and roll, forgets about the ominous, hostile, constant assassinations and this murderous war that never ended. And by 69, the structures as we knew them had fallen apart in the United States. Couples broke up, communes broke up. The most influential and inspiring performers died from strange drug overdoses. Who fucked up the dope was a big question. or were assassinated or committed suicide, or whose homes were set on fire. It was a hugely malevolent time with all the pleasures and ecstatic elements happening. Oh, okay, this is a signal for, is it here? No, it's not. So, where do I find the next film, which is supposed to be Jibala? She might find it. Sorry. Oh wait, let's just go back to where we were, because then we'll show this later. Okay, where were we? We're losing Vietnam. Okay, we'll go right here, yeah. And this is Water Light, Water Needle, 1966. And I juxtapose it to Snows because my work tends to go from the miserable, outrage, fury, to the ecstatic and the physical body in its strength and pleasures. So Water Light, Water Needle was inspired by my first time in Europe, going to Venice, and seeing that what was above was below, this sense of floating and suspension, reflection and refraction, almost a dizzying sense of suspension in space, and I wanted to build a version of it. So all these ropes were rigged at a time when St. Mark's Church was willing for me to hammer into their walls and ceilings with no insurance, an architect friend assisting, no budget, and performance that endangered the spectators. So there was a little note when they came in. You will be positioned under precarious motions, and it's possible that someone might fall on you. Protect yourself. Through an amazing coincidence, I was able to do an outdoor version of Water Light, Water Needle, because a kid who was helping rig stuff knew this place we could go to in Mahwah, New Jersey, an abandoned estate that turned out to be the Havemeyer estate. And those of you in art history know that all the important Impressionist works of the Metropolitan Museum are there because the Impressionists were discovered by Havelmeyer's daughter, the heir to a great sugar fortune, and the best friend America saw it. So the estate was abandoned, and we could rig and go naked in the water and move through the trees for an outdoor version. Going to more recent work, More Wrong Things began about 7 years ago with the sudden death of a very important cat in my life, and I was in such despair. I began to register in a concrete, focused way everything else in the world that was a disaster, fucked up. So I had footage from Haiti, I had footage from Sarajevo, from the Philippines, from Nigeria. People started just spontaneously sending me very disruptive, disturbing material that I could edit into a disturbing sequence, but position it in this beautiful installation in a museum, a castle museum in France. The atrocity images were triggered by people walking past the monitors, and the video material was all removed. And there's an image of the cat treasure that initiated the whole work. I'm going to end with a few recent installations. One, Devour, again, juxtaposes images of normalcy and domestic contentment with more disaster images, partly evolved from an earlier sequence. Okay, do you think it's right there now? No, not quite. She can do it. Where's the sound? Start over. Let me just say one thing about it. This initial footage was shot on 29th Street, looking into a Puerto Rican barber shop where I knew I would never be allowed in. And I just took a chance because I was looking at the most sensitized domestic imagery of one man with a blade in his hand, trimming the neck of another man. I wanted that piece of footage so badly. Okay. This is a sequence that you're all, to some extent, familiar with. And again, my motive was simply to get as close to the imagery as possible. It became an in memoriam, the way my work in mortal coils was an in memoriam to friends who had died within the same number of years. The title is Terminal Velocity. And there were very few images that I could work with because I could only work with newspaper that had a pixel. Anything from video was not a pixel. Anyway, it would dissolve, the smallest unit of video would dissolve on enlargement. So this is just the sequence of terminal velocity. It's about the size of what you're looking at. It's about 11 feet high. I'm going to end with my most recent work, Flange, 6 RPM. 6 RPM is the speed in most of my motors in the kinetic world starting in the 60s. I always had motors at 6 RPM. I'm still trying to understand why, but it seems like the perfect dynamic for being perceptually attentive to the motion. This is a complex work that started out with one shape, just like this. I saw something in the air, not quite a stick, not quite an arm, but I thought I wanted to do something with it. What could I do? So suddenly I was engrossed in a whole engineering projects for this simple image. I wanted many of them. I wanted these simple rectangular forms in motion. And I needed the advice of an engineer as to how to put this together. I'm working with lost wax process, pouring aluminum over these simple hand-sculpted shapes. And then they're motorized, so they're all in motion in a rather precarious shifting of coming together and moving away, together and away and around. And for weeks I went around talking to artist friends saying, has anyone done a work with some rectangular forms going like that? And I said, we don't think so, so maybe it's wrong. But I always need that reassurance. Recently, a version of Plans was shown through the generosity of Stephen Hall at, what's it called? T-Space in Rhinebeck, yeah. And that was lovely to have it in the countryside here. It had previously been at my gallery in New York City, PPW.